The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You can imagine my surprise when I came home one day to the sound of rushing water. Did a pipe burst? Had there been a break-in? Was the toilet overflowing? No. The cats had discovered how to turn on the kitchen sink. Everything from the Christmas tree to the plant dangling from the bookshelf is fair game when you have cats, and perhaps especially so with new kittens such as I have. If there's one thing they've taught me, it's that life can be messy. My fellow pet parents, and I'm guessing the parents of small human children as well, know all too well what I'm talking about. Life is unpredictable and messy. So much is unknown from one day, even 1 hour, to the next. And rarely can life's surprises, kittens and children included, be controlled. Life is messy. So why would we expect the life of faith to be any different? Faith is messy and far from perfect. Abraham, later exalted by Paul as the pinnacle of faith, was far from perfect. From the beginning of his call when he was still Abram, a severe famine forced him and his wife Sarai to Egypt for survival. Almost as soon as God calls him, Abram distrusts God's promises and lies to Pharaoh, saying that Sarai is his wife in order to spare his own life. Later, after God reiterates the divine promise yet again, still, Abram and Sarai distrust God. They don't believe that they'll have children because they're too old. It's just not possible. And so at that point, Sarai takes matters into her own hands, and she tells her husband to sleep with her slave Hagar in order to give him a son. Centuries later, Abraham and Sarah would find good company with the disciple Peter, who always seems to be putting his foot in his mouth in the most cringeworthy ways. Almost in the same breath as Peter boldly and bravely declares Jesus to be the Messiah, he then tries to get in the way of the work of that Messiah. And the seemingly harsh response leveled at him, "Get behind me, Satan." Later, on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's Peter who will suggest building 3 tents so that they can camp out and stay in this moment, only to be met with another divine rebuke. It's like poor Peter, noble as his intentions are, can't catch a break. And surely we can't forget his triple denial of ever knowing Jesus. And yet, even in spite of their shortcomings and failures, God is faithful. Abraham goes on to be the father of many nations and the first patriarch of what would become the nation of Israel. And Peter, witness to the resurrection, is the rock on which Christ builds his church. Did God screw up by calling such imperfect people to follow him, like Abraham and Sarah and Peter? Or maybe, did God know exactly what God was doing? Maybe God is trying to say something about the messy life of faith. Maybe God is showing us that God can use messy and messed up people because God, who is faithful, calls them. One of my favorite spiritual writers, Anne Lamott, has famously written, "The opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty." Faith doesn't mean having all of the answers or having a perfect track record. Faith is full of doubts and questions and uncertainty. That's why it's called faith. And in many ways, that's a lot more faithful than a total and unflinching assent to some set of beliefs or doctrine. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Jesus' call to discipleship is not a call to blindly follow and to ignore suffering. Taking up our cross is also certainly not a justification for enduring suffering or abuse, as this verse so often has been misused. Taking up our cross, as Jesus calls us, is to embark on a life of faith that is going to be challenging and uncertain and full of questions and missteps along the way. Taking up our cross calls us to a messy faith. A faith that stands where Jesus did, at the very center of the world's pain. A faith that looks at the image of God in those who suffer under the oppression of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, depression, addiction, or abuse. A faith that is not afraid to get its hands messy, to dig into the muck and mire, and to reach out in love. The life of faith is messy. It will probably leave us with more questions than answers. But it's a life that is no less faithful to the one who calls us, the one who sustains us, the one who washes us in the waters of baptism, the one who nourishes us at this table with bread and cup. We yearn for life to be easy. We yearn for a faith with a perfect track record, checking all the boxes. But that's not what faith is about. And there's some grace in that too. There's a lot of grace in that, actually. Because it's precisely in our doubts and our questions and our missteps that God calls us anyway, flaws and all. The God of Abraham, the patriarch of Israel who doubted and lied. The God of Sarah who laughed in the face of God's promises that seemed too good to be true. The God of Peter who didn't or couldn't understand what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah. The God of us, imperfect and flawed as we are, but no less beloved members of God's family. We're in good company with our fellow messed up ancestors in faith. We're in good, messy company with each other. If we wait until we have it all together to do the work of the gospel, until circumstances seem just right, until everything is lined up, until what? Then we're going to be waiting for a very long time. Jesus calls us to start now. As we are, with the gifts we bring, the experiences we have, the lives we are living. Let us now and ever walk with Jesus, because it is God who calls us, God who equips us, God who sustains us. Let us ever walk with Jesus now, for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of a hurting world in need of God's redemption. It's going to be messy, but such is faith.